The day began like any other on campus, with students moving between buildings, conversations blending into the background, and the steady rhythm of routine carrying everything forward without interruption. At the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, nothing felt unusual. People checked their phones, adjusted their schedules, and walked into lecture halls expecting nothing more than another ordinary day. Inside one of the academic buildings, a lecture was already in progress. The room was filled but calm, students either focused on their notes or quietly listening as the professor spoke in a steady, uninterrupted tone. Outside, the campus followed its usual flow, groups forming and separating, some students sitting and talking while others rushed to make it to class on time. There was no clear moment that warned anything was about to change. The transition began quietly, almost unnoticed, with a sound that didn't belong. It was sharp and unfamiliar, but at first it didn't register as anything serious. A few people paused, briefly distracted, trying to place what they had heard, but the normal rhythm of the environment quickly pulled them back. Then it happened again, closer and clearer. This time the reaction was different. Conversations slowed, attention shifted, and uncertainty began to spread. Inside the lecture hall, the professor stopped speaking mid-sentence, sensing that something outside the room had disrupted the normal flow. Students looked at each other, searching for confirmation that what they heard was real. Another sound followed, and now there was no confusion. The shift from uncertainty to fear was immediate. Someone near the back stood up, others turned toward the door, and within seconds the room lost its structure. The calm that had defined the space moments earlier disappeared as people moved toward the exit, not in an organized way but driven by instinct. In the hallway, the situation was already unfolding faster. Doors opened as students stepped out from different classrooms, each group carrying the same confusion that quickly turned into urgency. Voices overlapped, questions were asked without answers, and movement became unpredictable as people tried to decide which direction felt safer. The sound echoed again, cutting through everything, and this time it forced a single, clear reaction. Run. That one word spread through the space faster than anything else. It didn't need explanation. It didn't need confirmation. People began moving immediately, some toward stairwells, others toward exits, all of them focused on creating distance from something they still couldn't fully see. Outside the building, the reaction followed the same pattern. A few students started running first, then more joined, and within moments the open space was filled with movement. Some looked back briefly, but most didn't. The instinct to get away overpowered everything else. Inside, the hallway became chaotic. The same space that had been quiet minutes earlier now felt compressed, filled with overlapping voices and fast, uncertain movement. Some people tried to guide others, pointing toward exits, while others simply followed whoever seemed to know where they were going. In the lecture hall, the last few students moved out quickly, leaving behind a room that still held the echo of what had just happened. Outside the door, the flow of people continued, merging into a single direction that led away from the center of the disturbance. Across the campus, information began to spread, not as a clear message but as fragments. Texts were sent, calls were made, and warnings passed from one person to another, each version slightly different but carrying the same urgency. Something serious was happening and no one wanted to be near it. Some students didn't run immediately. They stopped at a distance, trying to understand what was going on, watching the movement around them for clues. Others moved until they felt far enough away, then turned back, looking toward the buildings with uncertainty and fear. Inside the building, not everyone had left. Some found rooms and closed the doors, choosing to stay hidden rather than risk moving through open spaces. Others stayed still, listening carefully, trying to determine where the sound had come from and whether it was getting closer. Silence settled in certain areas, but it wasn't calm. It was tense and deliberate, the kind of silence where every small noise feels amplified. A chair shifting, a phone vibrating, a distant echo in the hallway, each sound carried weight. Outside, the first emergency calls had already been made. The response was on its way, but for those on campus, time felt different. Moments stretched longer than they should, and every second carried uncertainty. Groups began forming in safer areas, people checking on each other, calling names, trying to account for who was there and who wasn't. The same questions repeated, but no one had complete answers. Some described hearing the first sound and not understanding it. Others said they knew immediately that something was wrong. A few had seen movement inside the building that confirmed their fear, but their descriptions didn't fully align. The details were inconsistent, shaped by perspective and the speed at which everything happened. Inside, those who remained hidden stayed as still as possible. They listened for movement, trying to interpret what each sound meant. Footsteps in the distance, A door somewhere opening or closing, the faint echo of something they couldn't identify, everything became significant. Outside, the first police vehicles arrived, their presence cutting through the confusion. Lights reflected across the campus as officers stepped out and moved quickly toward the building. Their focus was immediate, their actions controlled, but the information they received from those outside was fragmented. People tried to explain what they had seen or heard, but the urgency of the moment made it difficult to form a clear picture. Each account added something, but none of them told the full story. Inside the building, the presence of law enforcement had not yet reached everyone. For those still hidden, nothing had changed. They remained where they were, waiting, listening, hoping that the next sound they heard would not confirm their worst assumption. Outside, the campus had transformed. What had felt open and predictable now felt uncertain. Students stood at a distance, watching, trying to process what had just happened and what might still be happening. The routine of the day had been broken in a way that couldn't be undone. Classes, schedules, conversations, all of it had been replaced by something else entirely. And as the situation continued to unfold, one thing became clear. This was no longer just an interruption. This was the beginning of something much more serious. By the time the first wave of students reached the outer edges of the campus, the movement had slowed, but the uncertainty had not. Groups gathered in open areas, some standing close together, others keeping distance as they tried to make sense of what had just happened. Phones were in nearly every hand, messages spreading faster than confirmed information. No one had a complete picture. Some said it started inside one of the academic buildings. Others believed it came from outside and moved inward. A few insisted they had seen something directly, but even their accounts didn't fully match. The only consistent detail was the sound, sharp, unmistakable, and out of place. Inside the building, those who had not left were now operating on instinct rather than information. Doors were closed, lights dimmed, and movement reduced to the smallest possible actions. People stayed low, choosing silence over communication, listening carefully to anything that might indicate where the danger was. Every sound mattered. Footsteps in the distance carried meaning. A door closing somewhere down the hall created tension. Even the quiet hum of the building's systems felt louder than before. The environment that had once been familiar now felt unpredictable. Outside, the arrival of law enforcement changed the atmosphere, but it didn't bring immediate clarity. Police vehicles lined the approach roads, lights reflecting across the campus buildings. Officers moved quickly, coordinating positions, directing people away from certain areas, and attempting to establish control over a situation that was still unfolding. Students who had reached relative safety were now being guided further back, away from the main buildings. Some followed instructions immediately, while others hesitated, looking back, trying to understand what was happening inside. The need for information was strong, but the reality was that there wasn't enough of it yet. Within minutes, the campus began to shift from confusion to controlled response. Emergency protocols activated. Officers moved toward entry points. Communication lines opened between units. The structure that had been missing at the beginning was now forming, piece by piece. Inside, those still hidden sensed the change indirectly. The sounds began to shift. Movement became more deliberate. The unpredictable noise of panic was replaced by something more controlled, though still tense. No one moved unless they had to. Messages continued to circulate between those inside and those outside. Short texts, quick updates, incomplete details. Some simply confirmed they were safe. Others asked questions that couldn't yet be answered. Where are you? Are you okay? Do you know what's happening? Most responses were the same. No. Outside, small groups began to form more clearly. Friends found each other, names were called, and slowly, pieces of the situation came together on a personal level, even if the overall picture remained unclear. Some people realized who was missing. That realization changed the tone immediately. Concern replaced confusion. Calls were made again, this time more urgently. Messages sent repeatedly without response. Eyes fixed on phone screens, waiting for something, anything, that would confirm safety. Inside the building, time moved differently. Minutes felt extended, stretched by silence and uncertainty. People counted seconds without realizing it, measuring time through breaths, through the absence of sound. The instinct to stay still became stronger. Outside, additional emergency units arrived. The perimeter expanded and access points were controlled more tightly. Officers directed movement, ensuring that no one re-entered areas that had not yet been secured. The campus, which had once been open and accessible, was now divided. Safe zones. Restricted zones. Unknown zones. That division made the situation feel more real. Inside, the environment remained tense. Some individuals had positioned themselves behind desks or walls, using whatever was available as cover. Others stayed in corners, minimizing visibility, focusing entirely on remaining unnoticed. The lack of information was as powerful as the fear itself. People imagined possibilities, trying to fill in gaps with assumptions that were often worse than reality. Without clear updates, the mind created its own version of events. Outside, communication improved slightly. Authorities began to relay controlled information, instructing people to stay away from certain areas, to remain where they were if safe, and to avoid spreading unverified details. Even then, rumors moved faster. That's how situations like this evolve. Information travels quickly, but accuracy takes time. Inside the command structure forming outside, officers began piecing together the initial timeline. Reports from different individuals were compared, looking for patterns, for consistencies that could define where the situation had started and how it had progressed. The building at the center remained the focus. Entry teams prepared carefully, aware that incomplete information could lead to wrong assumptions. Every movement had to be deliberate, every decision based on what little was confirmed. Inside, those still waiting could sense that something was happening beyond the walls, but they couldn't see it. They could only interpret it through sound. Distant voices, controlled movement, moments of silence that felt longer than they should. Outside, the emotional weight of the situation continued to grow. Some students sat on the ground, unable to stand still, their attention fixed on the building. Others paced slowly, trying to release tension that had nowhere else to go. For many, the realization was settling in gradually. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't something that would be explained away in a few minutes. This was real. And it was still unfolding. Inside, those who had chosen to hide remained in place, even as time passed. The instinct to move was there, but the risk felt too high. Every decision carried uncertainty, and in that kind of environment, stillness often felt safer than action. Outside, the campus no longer resembled the place it had been earlier that day. The normal flow of movement had been replaced by controlled positioning, guided by emergency response rather than routine. What had started as an ordinary day had shifted completely, not in a gradual way, but in a sudden break that divided everything into before and after. And as the response continued to build, one fact became increasingly clear. Understanding what had happened would take time. But the impact of it had already begun. As the response continued to stabilize outside, the situation inside the building began to shift from uncertainty toward control. Entry teams moved carefully through designated points, clearing spaces one section at a time. Their approach was measured, not rushed, because incomplete information still carried risk. Every hallway, every room, and every corner had to be checked with precision. Communication improved slightly as more details were confirmed. The initial reports that had seemed scattered began to align into a clearer sequence. The sounds that triggered the panic had originated from within one of the academic buildings, and the movement that followed had spread outward in seconds. What had felt like multiple unknowns was gradually being narrowed into a single focus. Inside, those who had remained hidden began to hear a different kind of presence. Voices were more controlled now, directions were being given, and movement followed a pattern rather than chaos. The difference was subtle but important. It signaled that the situation was no longer uncontrolled. Some individuals stayed in place, waiting for direct instruction rather than acting on instinct. Others, hearing voices they recognized as authority, cautiously shifted their positions, still uncertain but beginning to believe that the immediate danger might be passing. Outside, investigators started collecting early statements from those who had been closest to the initial disturbance. These accounts were still fragmented, but certain elements repeated enough to stand out. The first sounds had drawn attention, but the reaction that followed had been shaped more by confusion than by clear understanding. No one had expected it. No one had prepared for it. That lack of preparation had amplified the chaos, allowing movement to spread in multiple directions at once. Some people had moved toward exits immediately, while others hesitated, trying to understand before acting. That difference in reaction created overlapping paths, making the initial moments harder to reconstruct. As more witnesses were identified, a clearer picture began to form. The event had not unfolded randomly across the campus. It had started in a specific location and expanded outward as people reacted to what they heard rather than what they saw. That distinction mattered, because it explained why so many accounts differed in detail but matched in timing. Inside the building, officers continued moving through rooms, confirming which areas were clear and which still required attention. Doors were opened carefully, announcements made, and individuals guided out in a controlled manner once it was safe to do so. For those emerging from hidden spaces, the transition was disorienting. The tension that had kept them still for so long didn't disappear immediately. Even as they stepped into secured areas, their movements remained cautious, their attention still fixed on sounds and signals around them. Outside, the perimeter held steady. Emergency personnel coordinated with each other, ensuring that movement remained controlled and that no one entered restricted zones. The campus was no longer an open environment. It had become structured around safety and response. At the same time, digital information began to play a larger role. Messages, call logs, and timestamps provided a secondary layer of insight, helping investigators align personal accounts with recorded timelines. While individual memories varied, the sequence of events began to take on a more consistent shape. The first sound, the shift in attention, the rapid movement outward. Those elements formed the foundation of the timeline. Inside, the final sections of the building were being cleared. The process was methodical, ensuring that no area was left unchecked. As each section was secured, the uncertainty that had defined the early moments continued to decrease. Eventually, a confirmation came through the internal communication channels. The immediate threat had been contained. That message changed the atmosphere both inside and outside. It didn't erase what had happened, but it marked a transition point. The situation was no longer actively unfolding in the same way. It had moved into a different phase. Outside, that shift was felt almost immediately. The urgency remained, but the direction became clearer. Attention moved from immediate safety toward understanding. People began asking different questions. Not just what is happening, but what happened. Inside, those who had been escorted out joined the growing number of individuals gathered in designated safe areas. Some spoke quietly with others who had been in similar positions, comparing experiences, trying to align what they had felt with what they now knew. The emotional impact was becoming more visible. The initial adrenaline that had driven movement and reaction was fading, replaced by a slower, heavier realization. For many, the day no longer felt connected to the hours that came before. It felt divided. Before the sound. After the sound. Outside, investigators continued building the timeline, now with more confidence. The focus narrowed to the specific area where everything had begun. That location, once part of an ordinary routine, was now central to understanding the entire sequence. Details were still being confirmed, but the overall structure no longer shifted with each new account. Instead, new information filled gaps rather than changing direction. That stability allowed the next phase to begin, identifying exactly how the event unfolded within that space. Inside, the final individuals were guided out, and the building transitioned fully into a secured environment. What had once been filled with movement and uncertainty was now quiet, observed, and documented. Outside, the campus remained under control, but the atmosphere had changed. The immediate urgency had passed, replaced by a focused effort to understand and explain. For those who had been there, the experience remained fragmented. Each person carried a different version of the same event, shaped by where they stood, what they heard, and how they reacted. But as those fragments were brought together, a clearer picture continued to emerge. What had felt like chaos in the moment was beginning to show structure. And that structure would determine everything that followed. As the situation moved fully into a controlled phase, the focus shifted from immediate response to detailed reconstruction. The building remained secured, and access was limited to investigators and authorized personnel. What had once been an active, chaotic environment was now quiet, examined piece by piece. Inside, the process became methodical. Every room was revisited, every hallway re-evaluated, and every detail documented with precision. The goal was no longer to react, but to understand. Movement patterns, positions, and timing were all being analyzed to create a clear sequence of events. Early statements were now being compared more carefully. While initial accounts had been fragmented, the overlap between them began to reveal consistent points. The event had started within a specific section of the building, and the reaction had spread outward almost instantly, driven more by sound than by direct observation. That explained the confusion. People hadn't seen the beginning clearly. They had reacted to it. Outside, investigators expanded their work beyond the building. Surveillance footage from nearby areas was being reviewed, and timestamps were aligned with emergency calls and witness statements. Each source added another layer of confirmation, narrowing down uncertainties that had defined the early moments. The timeline became more precise. The first indication of disruption. The moment attention shifted. The rapid escalation that followed. Each stage was now being placed within a structured sequence rather than a series of disconnected events. Inside the investigation team, roles became more defined. Some focused on physical evidence within the building, while others worked with digital records and external data. The coordination between these groups allowed information to move more efficiently, reducing the gaps that had existed earlier. Witnesses were re-interviewed, this time with more specific questions. Instead of broad descriptions, they were asked to focus on details: positions, timing, direction of movement. These second accounts were more consistent, not because memories had improved, but because the framework around them had become clearer. Patterns began to stand out. The initial disturbance drew attention quickly. Individuals moved toward or away from the source based on instinct. The lack of clear information caused multiple interpretations, which then shaped how people reacted in the following seconds. That sequence explained why the event had felt larger and less defined in the moment. Inside the building, certain areas received more focus. The section where everything began was examined repeatedly, not because it held all the answers, but because it provided the most direct connection to the timeline. Distances were measured, angles considered, and movement paths reconstructed. These details helped explain how quickly the situation had developed. The environment itself played a role. Confined spaces, limited visibility, and echoing sound all contributed to the way people interpreted what was happening. What one person heard clearly, another heard differently. What one person saw directly, another only sensed indirectly. Understanding those differences was critical. Outside, communication continued to improve. Official updates replaced speculation, providing confirmed details rather than assumptions. While not every question could be answered immediately, the information that was released helped stabilize the broader environment. Students and staff remained in designated areas, many still processing what had happened. Conversations shifted from confusion to reflection, as individuals began to align their personal experiences with the confirmed timeline. Inside, the reconstruction reached a point where the sequence of events no longer changed with each new detail. Instead, additional information reinforced what had already been established. The event had a clear beginning, a defined progression, and a contained end. That clarity marked a turning point in the investigation. It allowed attention to move from what happened to how and why it happened. Investigators reviewed the timeline again, this time not looking for gaps but for connections. The sequence was no longer uncertain, but the factors that led to it required deeper analysis. What conditions allowed the situation to escalate so quickly? What moments, if any, could have altered the outcome? These questions extended beyond the immediate event, but they were essential to understanding its full impact. Inside the secured area, the atmosphere remained controlled and focused. The intensity of the initial response had been replaced by steady, deliberate work. Every action now contributed to a larger understanding rather than an immediate outcome. Outside, the campus still reflected the weight of what had occurred. Movement remained limited, and the normal rhythm had not yet returned. Even in areas far from the building, the sense of disruption was clear. For many, the day was no longer defined by its routine, but by a single moment that changed everything that followed. As the investigation continued, one thing became increasingly evident. What had felt like a sudden, chaotic event could now be understood as a sequence. Not random, not without structure, but shaped by timing, environment, and reaction. And that understanding would define the next phase of the case. As the reconstruction reached a stable form, the investigation moved into a deeper phase focused on identifying the individual at the center of the event. The timeline was no longer shifting, and the sequence of actions had been established with enough clarity to begin narrowing the field of possibilities. Inside the command structure, information from multiple sources was brought together and reviewed in detail. Witness accounts, digital records, and physical evidence were no longer treated separately. They were layered, compared, and aligned to reveal patterns that could not be seen in isolation. One detail became increasingly important: position. Not just where people were, but how they moved in relation to the initial disturbance. Most individuals reacted after the first sound, either stepping away or moving toward exits without hesitation. Their movements were driven by confusion and instinct. But a smaller number of movements did not follow that pattern. Those differences stood out. In several accounts, there were mentions of someone who had not reacted in the same way as others. While most people responded immediately, this individual appeared more controlled, more deliberate. The descriptions were not identical, but they shared a common theme: present but not engaged, observing rather than reacting. That distinction shifted the direction of the investigation. Video footage from surrounding areas began to support this pattern. While the interior of the building had limited visual coverage, external cameras captured movement before and after the event. By aligning these recordings with the established timeline, investigators were able to track how individuals entered and exited the area. One sequence drew particular attention. A figure entering the building during a period when the crowd was still forming, not at the beginning and not at the peak. The timing placed this person within a window where attention was already divided and awareness was reduced. The same figure appeared again in footage shortly after the event, moving away from the area without hesitation. The pace was steady, not rushed, and the direction suggested familiarity with the surroundings. That consistency reduced randomness. It suggested intention. Inside the investigation team, this sequence was reviewed repeatedly. Each frame was examined for details, movement patterns, physical characteristics, and timing relative to other individuals in the area. The figure did not interact directly with others in a noticeable way. There were no clear signs of confrontation or engagement before the event. That absence made the behavior more significant, not less, because it indicated separation. Someone who was present, but not part of the environment in the same way as everyone else. Witnesses were brought in again, this time shown still images and short clips extracted from the footage. Their reactions varied, but a few identified the same figure as someone they had noticed earlier. "He wasn't with anyone," one witness said. "He just stood there watching." Another added a similar detail, describing someone who had moved closer to the area of tension without participating in it. These confirmations were not definitive on their own, but together they strengthened the pattern. Inside the analysis process, behavior became the primary focus. Arrival timing, position relative to others, movement before and after the event. Each element pointed toward a profile that was becoming more specific. Outside, investigators expanded their search to include nearby transportation routes. Vehicle movement, pedestrian paths, and surrounding infrastructure were all considered as potential extensions of the timeline. The goal was to identify how the individual moved beyond the immediate area. A potential match emerged. A vehicle seen in multiple camera angles, arriving within the same time frame and leaving shortly after the event. The positioning of the vehicle suggested it had not been parked randomly. It was placed with access in mind, allowing for a direct exit without delay. That detail aligned with the behavior already observed. Controlled movement. No hesitation. Clear direction. Inside, this connection was examined carefully. The vehicle registration provided a starting point, but it was not treated as confirmation. Instead, it was another layer to be tested against existing evidence. Records were reviewed. Associations were mapped. Any connection, direct or indirect, to individuals on campus was considered. A name began to surface. Not immediately obvious, but present within certain communication networks linked to the event. The connection was not strong enough to stand alone, but when combined with the behavioral pattern and the vehicle data, it became significant. Investigators moved cautiously at this stage. The goal was not to rush toward a conclusion, but to ensure that every piece aligned before taking further action. Inside the timeline, the individual's presence now had a defined position. Arrival during a period of reduced awareness. Proximity to the area where the event began. Departure immediately after, without visible confusion. That sequence separated this individual from the rest. Outside, additional verification steps were taken. Location data, where available, was compared against the established timeline. Small confirmations began to appear, each one reinforcing the same direction. Inside the investigation team, the tone shifted again. What had started as a broad reconstruction was now narrowing toward identification. The difference was subtle but important. The case was no longer about understanding what had happened. It was about confirming who was responsible. And for the first time since the beginning, that question was no longer open in every direction. It was pointing toward a specific answer. By the time the investigation reached its final phase, the pattern that had once seemed uncertain was now consistent across every source. The timeline held. The movements aligned. The behavior that stood out at the beginning had become the defining element of the case. Inside the command center, all available material was reviewed one more time, not to search for new information, but to confirm that nothing had been missed. Witness accounts, surveillance footage, and digital records all pointed in the same direction. The sequence no longer shifted. It reinforced itself. The individual identified earlier was no longer just a possibility. He had become the central focus. Verification moved carefully. Background information was examined, not to build assumptions, but to understand context. There was no immediate history that explained everything, no single detail that made the outcome obvious. Instead, what emerged was a pattern of behavior that matched what had already been observed. Detached, controlled, present without engagement. Those traits, once subtle, now carried weight. Outside, coordination between units began to take a more targeted form. The location associated with the individual was identified and confirmed through multiple checks. Movement patterns suggested he had not traveled far after leaving the campus, and that consistency reduced the urgency of a wide-area search. The approach was planned with the same care that had defined the investigation. No unnecessary risk. No sudden movement that could disrupt the situation. Just controlled execution. At the location, everything appeared still. There were no signs of immediate activity, no visible indication that anything unusual had taken place there. The environment matched the pattern already established, calm on the surface with something more deliberate beneath it. Officers positioned themselves quietly, ensuring that all angles were covered. Communication remained minimal, focused only on timing and coordination. Then the approach began. A knock. No response. A second attempt, firmer. Still nothing. A brief pause followed, not from hesitation but from procedure. Every step had to be followed correctly. Entry was made without delay. Inside, the space was orderly. Nothing suggested urgency or panic. There were no signs of preparation to leave, no indication of disruption. The absence of those signs was consistent with everything that had been observed so far. In one of the rooms, they found him. He was not moving, not reacting, just present. For a moment, the space held stillness on both sides. Then instructions were given clearly and directly. He complied without resistance, standing, allowing the process to continue without interruption. That response confirmed more than words could have. Outside, as he was brought out, the environment remained controlled. There were no sudden movements, no escalation. The transition from identification to custody was completed with the same precision that had defined every step leading to it. Inside the investigation, the final stage moved quickly. Confirmation. Alignment. Documentation. Every piece that had been collected was now connected directly to the individual. The timeline, once a reconstruction, had become a sequence tied to a single source. The question that remained was not about identity anymore. It was about motive. Interviews began with the same structure as before, controlled, focused, and precise. The responses did not come all at once. They formed gradually, shaped by pauses and partial explanations. There was no single statement that defined everything. Instead, the explanation reflected the same pattern that had been present from the beginning. Awareness, timing, opportunity. The individual had not created the initial tension. He had recognized it. What others experienced as confusion, he saw as a moment where attention shifted and structure weakened. That moment became the point where action was taken. He had entered without drawing attention, positioned himself without engagement, and left without hesitation. The sequence was consistent from beginning to end. Inside the final report, the case was no longer described as an unpredictable event. It was defined by its structure, how quickly it developed, how widely it was misunderstood in the moment, and how clearly it could be understood once every piece was aligned. Outside, the campus had begun the slow process of returning to normal, but the change remained visible. Movement was quieter. Conversations carried weight. The routine that had once felt automatic now felt more deliberate. For those who had been there, the experience remained divided into two parts. Before it happened. After it happened. Inside the investigation, the work reached its conclusion not with a single moment, but with a complete understanding of the sequence. What had once been fragments had become a full narrative, each part connected, each detail accounted for. The event did not remain as confusion. It became clarity. And that clarity ensured that what happened would not be reduced to a moment of chaos, but remembered as something understood in full.